A reading of Mr. John Miller Jr.'s Hurricane Audrey story, written by Mr. Miller in August of 2018. The reader is Charles McNeely. It was about 4:30 a.m. when the neighbor that lived in the house on the beach woke us up. Water was already in our front yard. We lived about a mile north of the Gulf. We quickly got up, got dressed, and started to leave. Our house was about 200 yards north of the main road. Where our driveway ended at the road was a cattle guard. A cattle guard had already washed out, so we could not leave. We went back to the house to ride out the storm. The house we lived in was a big farmhouse. It had 3 layers of floor and a 12-foot ceiling. The reason for the thick floor was the house at one time was a dance hall, and people would shoot holes in the floor. Instead of patching the holes, the owner would just put a new floor over the old one. That made the house heavy, and it would not float. It started to break up. When that happened, we all got up in the attic. We wasn't in the attic long when the roof started to cave in on us. There was 10 of us in the attic, 5 adults and 5 children. That included my father, mother, brother, his wife, and a neighbor, and then 5 children, 4 between 18 months and 7 years old, and me, 14 years old. My sister-in-law was holding the baby in her arms when the roof collapsed. I got under it to try to hold it off of her and the baby. When the roof slid off my back, nails cut me from my shoulder to almost my belt. After that, I was on a piece of the attic floor, trying to help my mother to get on it with me. A wave hit us and it flipped over. When that happened, I fell off and went under all the way to the ground. The water was about 25, 30 feet deep. I came up, but I could not get my head above the water. I kept coming up under parts of the house. I just gave up and went down again. When I reached the ground, I had a vision of a beautiful woman. I could not see her face, but I could see her long, cold, black hair. And I thought to myself, I have to find out who she is. That gave me the courage to push myself up again. When I reached the top, I was able to get my head above the water. I caught a piece of the house that was floating by, but I was too weak to get on it. I just held on to it until I was able to pull myself up. At that time, I saw the children floating face up. Their mouth and eyes was full of water. I saw my dad floating in one direction and my brother floating in another direction. I didn't see anyone else. When I pulled myself up on the drift, I started drifting. The drift was on part of the attic floor. It was about 4 feet wide and 6 foot long. It had 3 2x6 planks nailed to it. The 2x6 was extending out on both sides, and that allowed me to sit on the middle one and then hold on to the other 2 that was on each side of me. Now, the waves kept flipping it over and throwing me off, and I had to fight to get back on. I couldn't swim and still can't. It was no piece of cake. I really had to fight to catch it and get back on. As I was drifting, I knew when I got to Calcasieu Lake because the water was cold. The Gulf water is warm, so I knew when the water turned cold, I was in Calcasieu Lake. I drifted for about 10 hours, finally reaching the Intercoastal Canal. That was another fight, except this fight with snakes, water moccasins. the snakes started to come on the drift I was on. I would catch them and back of the head and throw them off the drift until I realized what I was doing. I jumped off the drift. Water was about waist deep, and walked to the canal. When I got to the canal, I met up with some of my neighbors that had drifted there also. On the other side of the canal, there was a tugboat anchored there. They stopped there to ride out the storm. We all got on a piece of a house, and two of the men swam us across the canal so we could get help. When we got on the boat, some of the workers gave us clothes. They had us come into the galley, and they gave us food and coffee. They raised anchor and went to the Gibbstown Bridge. The boat could not go under the bridge, and the water was too high, so they could not open the bridge. At that, the boat turned around and took us to the locks. At the locks, we was put on a Coast Guard boat and went to Lake Charles. I think someone said we were the first ones to get there after the storm. Now, I had an uncle who lived in Lake Charles, Mr. Clarence Miller, a Lake Charles Police Department officer. He met me at the docks and took me to his house. We kept coming back to the docks to try to identify the dead, and that was almost impossible. Most of them was so disfigured. After a few days, I went back to Cameron. I tried to get a job, but I was too young. I was homeless for a while. I slept on the ground and ate what I could catch or kill. Some of the birds and fish I had to eat raw. I couldn't start a fire, and I didn't have a penny to buy a box of matches. And I am one that won't steal. So some days, I went hungry. My brother Alvin got out of the Navy, and I stayed with him for a while. I finally got a job at a service station, working nights and going to school in the daytime. I stayed with my other brother, Kirby, and then my sister, Rita Miller Badon. By that time, I was old enough to be on my own. It wasn't easy, but I wanted to do it. I didn't like living with other people. I was still going to school, 1 year at Grand Lake, 1 year at Johnson Bayou, and then to South Cameron High School. I learned a lot in that time. I learned how to live in the marsh. I learned how to be a street fighter. I learned how to make do with what I had. And I learned who I could trust and who I couldn't trust. When I was a senior at South Cameron High School, I still had to work. I would have liked to play sports, but I had to work. I would have liked to go on field trips with my class, but could not. I had to work. When it came time for graduation, we started practicing, and I got to thinking, I don't have money to buy good clothes or shoes to be like my classmates, so I quit going to school. At that time, I was working for Clayton Nunez in his service station in Cameron. He closed the service station, and we all went to Texas City, Texas. Clayton and his family did return to Cameron, but I stayed in Texas City. I got a job working in another service station. It was there that I met my first wife. She stopped in to buy 50 cents worth of gas. At that time, that was about 2 gallons. The rest, as they say, is history. I think I did well for myself. I worked for the city of Dayton, Ohio, and retired from there. We had 2 fine boys who are doing good for themselves. Beverly and I divorced, and again, I lost everything I worked for. I again got married to my present wife, Deborah. She had a 5-year-old son, which I adopted. We are still living in Ohio, and Anthony, our son, is the mayor of the town we live in. The one thing I have learned from this is never give up. There is always a light at the end of the tunnel. And one final note, I was talking to a classmate of mine about 2 months ago. He asked me if I ever got my high school diploma. I told him no, because I had quit school. He told me, no, you didn't. We all went to bat for you, and they called your name at graduation. Your diploma is in the school office. I called the school counselor and asked about it. She couldn't find the original diploma, but she looked up my school record and got me a copy. So 58 years later, I got my diploma. Hurricane Audrey took everything I had, but the one thing she couldn't take was the fond memories of my early childhood. She destroyed my home, but she couldn't destroy my will. She killed my parents, but she couldn't kill my determination to go on with my life. Never give up.